Thank you for listening to my presentation on Abe Kobo. What is your image of Japan? Ten years ago, something terrible happened that many of us felt much uncertainty about the future. We've seen the pictures of that day, the video, the destruction, the hopelessness. I want to present to you a novel today which has some themes of hopelessness and talk about some Japanese ideology that fueled the war of the 20th century and how it was extinguished, and how the literature of a Japanese outsider artist confronts it with his also some uncertainty about the themes of women in the future and their role and how it remains diminished after post-war in post-war Japan. And I leave you with messages of hope. But let me start with two stories for context. The first begins in Manchuria, or modern-day China. This was a significant puppet government known as Manchukuo. The red boxes are the dates of Japanese annexation of various lands in the region. In Manchukuo, late 1945, the story begins here of a young man who has spent nearly his whole life across the East Sea or Sea of Japan in an outpost called Mukden. It's in modern-day Shenyang. The young man has just returned from Tokyo, where he was training to be a doctor. His own father, a doctor himself, has just died. And that's what has brought him back to take care of his widowed mother. As the war comes to a close, the bombs that spell the doom for the imperialist ambitions of Japan, the young man and his mother escape the Russians and get back to Tokyo, only to find their city decimated. He will go on to get a medical degree, but when he graduates, he chooses art over science. He's Abe Kobo, a critic, artist, and playwright. And I'm going to tell you about him today. But there's another story I want to tell you about that shows my own interest in Japan and Abe Kobo. It's about another young boy who was 12 years younger than him, but born in the same year of the rat, Chinese Lunar Year, in the Philippines. And his story begins in 1945, and he's 8 years old in Manila. And he was brought here from the Bicol region with his sisters after the Japanese invaded in 1942. The children became orphans, and they were sent to different relatives to live with. Here, he's living in Manila on the streets. He ran away from his house, from his foster home, and the Allied forces have just bombed Manila, and you can see the bombing there. And these are some of the children themselves. My dad was like one of these youngsters. Yeah, this is a story about my own father. He uh, actually got a medal of sorts, a bullet wound to his own foot by a Japanese soldier when he stole some bread and refused to stop running. The American soldiers couldn't save him, but he continued to live on the streets while his city cleaned up. But he got lucky. He was able to secure passage on a ship when he was in his late teens, and he had met a captain, and the captain had brought him to New Orleans. And it was in New Orleans that my father actually jumped off the ship into there was a Mississippi or some water there, and started his own American dream, and that sealed my own existence. I'm interested in Japan and in the war and people affected by the war. I was also in the military. I went to Okinawa much later than 1945. I went there just after 9/11, and I learned about some of the things that we did to the country there. And Abe Kobo, this is a quote from his book. This goes against a lot of the Shinto beliefs and acceptance and honoring all life. He's one of the few literary writers of his time to, I think, maybe the only one to have spent much of his life, nearly all of his life, in a war zone. He saw sides of destruction, both sides as both oppressor and as being destroyed. He also writes about an ancient Japan, a mythos. It lives beneath the day-to-day consciousness of normal citizens. His beliefs are also based in Shinto ideology, and a lot of his stories intersect with Western beliefs and Christianity, especially. If you look at Murakami Haruki today, an experimental writer such as him, you can trace a direct line to Abe Kobo. And I want to talk about this book today, Woman in the Dunes. It was written in 1962. Abe Kobo was a member of the Japanese Communist Party. He and his wife since the 50s, but he broke out of it because of its limits on personal freedom, mainly. And the English version is here. It was written in 1964, the same year as the Japanese Olympics. The translation by Eodol Sanders. It's a little bit of a dated translation. I think that in the future, this will be retranslated. The literary world was introduced to a very unique person who tied a lot of the glory and the shame of Japanese past to universal ideas and genres outside of Japan. His name was Kimifusa, Abe Kimifusa. Kimifusa was a natal reading of his kanji. He changed to Kobo later. I mentioned he was unique. He was unique to the literary scene because he was called a gaichi. And the gaichi is someone who has spent most of their life, or nearly all of their life, abroad. In his heyday, he was compared to Mishima Yukio, but as an outsider, he was never able to shake that label. Even though was very famous here in Japan, and most people know his name, very few people, if any, actually read him today. His story, Woman in the Dunes, it literally means sand woman. I need to tell you a little bit about the story. It's a story about a school teacher. He's an amateur entomologist on the weekend. These are illustrations by Abe's wife. They populate the book. He goes on a bug collecting mission, gets kidnapped by some villagers who live near the sea. And these villagers are kind of stuck in time. And it's a surreal scene. He's forced to live in a hole with a woman and help her shovel sand from the house. And that's their life. It's an absurd idea. And this is where the absurdism comes in. If you stop shoveling, the entire village would disappear. About the language of this book, it's very dense, and it gives you the feeling that you're also stuck in sand, and it's hyper-focused, makes you look at all the details. Abe is well known for blurring the boundaries between science and detail. That's another thing that I have in common with him, is that I'm interested in science, but I'm also interested in literature. But it's a little bit of a to the point of absurdity, the amount of detail he puts into his book. The man in the story tries to escape. He's never successful. He learns that the woman is widowed. He begins to have some empathy for her. Her husband and daughter are buried somewhere nearby in the sand. He takes pity on her. They eventually become lovers. The man is never allowed to leave. He tries to escape, and this is one of the things he made. He made it's a crow trap. He hoped to attach a message to the crow, catch a crow, touch a message, and maybe the people would come rescue him. Of course, it was foolish. But what's even more foolish is that this machine became a water collecting device, actually. And he goes into great detail of how it uses capillary action to draw water from the sand. And with that, he's able to get freedom from the villagers, his captors, who withhold water to make him work. So he's able to get water. One of his questions is, if I trap someone who craves freedom, can I psychologically trap them if I offer them what they want? In the story, the woman becomes pregnant, and her pregnancy is abnormal, and she goes to a hospital. In their haste, the villagers actually leave the rope ladder accessible to the man, and he climbs out of the hole. But he does not run, and this is at the end of the book, and we realize that he realizes that he wants to share news of his invention with someone, and no one in the real world will appreciate his invention as much as the villagers, his own captors. So he decides to stay, and um, yeah, he decides to uh, free himself from his old life. But has he given up one form of bondage for another? What is significant is that he escapes the meaningless credentials, certificates, licenses. These are symbols of his past, and also, by extension, the psychological chains of Japanese imperialism, I believe. He climbs back into the hole in order to set himself free. At least he has freedom of choice. When I was reading, I wished he had escaped from the village, but he learns that freedom exists in the mind, and it's another idea. And this is a quote that starts the novel. We can look at his decision to stay rather than flee as a form of survival. He had become cleansed. The hole was like a sort of purgatory for him. He was no longer being punished because he did not want to fly. If you want to have think about one interpretation of the quote that starts the book, he stops trying to escape. One of the things I had difficulty with is connecting his experiences with what he wrote in 1962, and that's what I'm here to tell you a little bit about. There's so many things to tell you about, but it's a dystopian novel, and I believe it makes a statement about Japanese ideology that fueled the war and how it became extinguished. Abe himself has talked as a writer of a ruined Japan, and the word ruined. These are very choice words, I think, and he's not just talking about his country being ruined, his nation being ruined, but the buildings and things like that. He's talking about, I think, the ideology that probably the Shinto beliefs that had become corrupted and turned into the form of barbarism that infected the world, much like the sand that infected the village. And through his own choice of literature, he thought that he could fix, or he thought he could confront this ideology and show the masses that these are things that these are not Japanese things. And it's interesting because he's not Japanese. He's Japanese, but he's not. And this is where he diverges from Mishima, who was very nationalistic. Mishima wanted a strong Japan. Abe fought against big government. This is one of the statements he has regarding big government, and one of the reasons he left the Communist Party. And I kind of changed up my research recently while preparing for this conference. I became interested in the role of women, and I don't think this is talked much about, believe it or not, in the literature. As the woman is there. The story of the book is Woman in the Dunes, but she's mostly absent. Most of the narrative is we're stuck in the man's point of view. Everything is filtered through the man's consciousness. And what do we make of this? I think it's an accurate portrayal of how women are seen, especially in Japan post-war, leading up to the war. The lack of power, but we see the strength and how the woman works day and night shoveling sand. And part of this Christian thing I was thinking about is that she does kind of resemble Mary, and she sacrifices in a Christ-like way at the end of the book when she gets an ectopic pregnancy, goes to the hospital, and that enables the man to be free. This is a statement on Japanese women that are mostly silent, but they're working behind the scenes and actually, should be regarded better. And this is one of the sad things if you look at this chart. Even though women outnumber the men in bachelor's degrees in Japan, it's the fifth worst gender gap in the world. There is paternal care. Men can stay home, but only 3% take it, believe it or not. And 10% of the seats in parliament, only 10% are filled by women. And in America, 24% of the House and 24% of the Senate, 27% of the House are filled by women. So you wonder, in Japan, 10% of the government is filled by women. Where are they all? Maybe they're shoveling sand at the bottom of a sand dune. And just last night on CNN, I read that only 5% of Japanese women are board members of companies. I want to tell you more about this novel and the artist, and I will. He's interesting. He wrote one of his last books and one of the first books in Japan, entirely on a word processor. It was unheard of at the time. He was always pointed to the future. He was a science fiction writer in a way. He predicted the fall of communism. He was interested in ideas. He wrote about the dangers of technology in his novels. Technology is a very big theme of Woman in the Dunes, and people have written books on it. He's also credited for, as I mentioned, being a science fiction writer. He was interested in ideas, and speculative fiction is where his ideas could find a home. And I want to tell you quickly about another writer that I admire. His name is Kurt Vonnegut, and he wrote a lecture about the shape of stories. And, we can see Abe's story as fitting one of his lectures called The Man in the Hole. Vonnegut submitted his master's thesis to the University of Chicago, and they actually failed him. His thesis was about how every story has a shape. And this is definitely a man in the hole story. And if Vonnegut were alive today, I'd hope that he would mention the woman down there too. I can't explain this chart right now, but if you look at YouTube, you can find his famous lecture on the shape of stories. And about the film is very famous. I want to tell you more about the film too. But Roger Ebert liked it, and that's all you need to know. As we look back nearly 10 years ago to the day of the earthquake, this country knows how to get shattered, but it also knows how to become whole again. And that's a message of hope that I want you to take home from the future. This country has rebuilt itself. Like the man in the hole, he was able to finally be able to escape, but he decided to stay with a community of people who wanted to listen to him. So what is your message of hope?